So we are starting our program. Good morning to all participants and also to our speakers. Today is the fifth day of our international online workshop on gender studies, Her Story, Past, Present and Future. And in the pre-lunch session today, we have three speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Projit Bihari Mukharji, who is a visiting professor at Ashoka University, New Delhi, and also Professor of History of Science at University of Pennsylvania. Projit will speak on gendering science, what history of science can show us. So I welcome you, Projit, and I request you to start your presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you to Srimati, my teacher, for inviting me to this, and to Professor Dash, who sort of took care of all the arrangements. Okay, thank you so much. What I want to talk about today is basically, I thought I will start with a little bit of preface about how history of science can illuminate the question of the gendered nature of science in general, and then move into some specific case studies from one particular case study from my own research, and then conclude with some reflections on how history can actually help us in the present of transforming the kind of science we have. So for most people, the history of science means usually a list of long discoveries and progress. So maybe we could just go to the first slide. The first slide. Yeah, thank you. So for most people, and this is not like, don't take the image literally, but this is kind of what usually people understand to be history of science. A list of names and discoveries and progress, where we are constantly getting closer and closer to some kind of elusive truth about nature. The actual scientific truths or conclusions are therefore not thought to be historical in the sense that, say, literary works are thought to be historical. We recognize readily that a great work of literature, no matter how great, is going to reflect the social values of its time. But we do not do the same with science. We think science somehow, at least good, rigorous science, discovers natural laws that are somehow independent of human history. This attitude is particularly a problem when it comes to issues of gender. When we read highly gendered descriptions of men and women in, say, an 18th century drama or a 19th century novel, it's not that big a problem because we recognize that, well, it's in a work of literature and it was reflecting the values of its time. But when we read similarly gendered descriptions of men and women or other actors in older scientific works, we are not as readily aware of the way society has influenced those conclusions. If the social values are pointed out to us, we often retort by saying, well, that was bad science or pseudoscience. So what is missing is that a recognition that even good, rigorous science is always shaped by prevalent, historically specific social structures and value systems that seem to, and this runs counter to our popular lay understanding of what is science. We think only bad science gets influenced by society, whereas good science is somehow ahistorically true. To begin with, therefore, let me offer you an abstract framework to demonstrate how history might shape science. I follow this then with a detailed example of one particular major instance of a gendered scientific theory and how history shaped that. And finally, in conclusion, I will reflect briefly on how a historically sensitive understanding of science can actually enrich contemporary science as well as challenge the gendered hierarchies in our contemporary society. So let me move to my first example. The key to historicizing science is the recognition that while science produces universal conclusions that are said to be valid irrespective of time and place, its practical operations depend upon very specific and particular objects. Take an example. Let us say a botanist is trying to classify a particular plant. No matter how rigorous and objective she is, it is absolutely impossible for her to go around looking at every single instance of that plant anywhere in the world. So what she will do is more likely depend on one or two specimen samples or maybe a handful of samples to arrive at her conclusions. So these are what historians of science, these samples or specimens are what historians of science call working objects. Now, every science needs such working objects. When a geologist studies rocks, once again, she does not study every single rock of that particular type. In fact, she might not even know of where exactly every single instance of this rock exists. She will study a particular working object or sample or specimen, or maybe a handful of them. Same is the case with a medical researcher. When somebody studies a disease, they don't study every single instance of that disease. They study a few cases, maybe even a few hundred cases, but not every case. And this is where history creeps in. While the conclusions are general, the actual working object or specimen on which that conclusion is based is always particular. And that particularity depends naturally on existing social conditions. So the moment we recognize that universal conclusions of science depend on the particularity of samples and specimens, we begin to see how history inserts itself into scientific conclusions. After all, to access a specific plant or piece of rock, the scientist needs to depend upon all sorts of contemporary historical actors and infrastructures. This in turn will shape what kind of particular sample was at hand and what kind of conclusion could be generated. If we stick to our example of plants, this becomes slightly clearer. Let us assume, for instance, that a botanist in 1850s London wishes to study a plant that only grows in Bengal. How does she, or more likely he, at that time, go about it? He will need to either travel to Bengal to see the plant for himself or have someone send him one or two plants he can study in England itself. Now, should he choose to travel to Bengal himself, a number of historically specific actors and infrastructures will immediately become crucial for him. First things first, he will need money to travel. How will he find this money? Who will pay for it? Usually, say, a rich merchant or a government or such as was the case in the 19th century, a company like the East India Company might finance this trip. But they will only finance the trip if it suits their purposes. So the research agenda will already have to be shaped in one way by the patronage. The funding will also then determine how long he can stay. And for plants, this is very important because as we all know, a plant after a particularly rough summer looks very different than it does in peak monsoon. So if a scientist arrives on the field right after a very hot summer, the plant is going to look very different, and that is going to have a consequence for how he will classify it. Even more importantly, were he to arrive in Bengal personally, where will he go? He can't just get off a ship and go and find a plant. He will need other people to show him that plant. Now, that means a social network comes in. Who are the people that he will turn to? In what language will he speak? Now, these are not stupid or simple questions. They are historically specific questions that have historically specific answers that in turn have immense consequences for the kind of science that is produced. As this audience would no doubt know that the number of English speakers in Bengal in the 1850s was very small. It would therefore be automatic that our imaginary botanist who comes to Bengal would only talk to some people, a very small section of the population. It is also highly likely, more than likely, that it is going to be a man who is going to talk to him. It is also very likely that the English-speaking man that he talks to in Calcutta would not be somebody who has a lot of hands-on experience of how plants grow in fields or forests. This is likely to be a babu or some kind of an elite gentleman with college education or some degree of school education, at least not somebody who works in the farm or works in the forest. So if the English scientist then depended on these men, as he would have to, the person in turn would probably gather his information from other more subaltern figures. So the Babu might ask his Mali, but the Mali will not directly speak to the English botanist. So there's a chain that happens. And in this chain, in history of science, we call these go-betweens. A number of go-betweens then connect the specimen to the scientist. A lot of information about the plant might be lost in translation just because the language does not exist, or because the people, there are many links in the chain. Just as we know, if you, that childhood game which we have all played, where I think it used to be called Chinese whispers, that if you whisper something in one person's ear, by the time it gets to the end of the chain, the thing has become something else. So here we see that how the mediation of the object, not only the object itself, the specificity of it, but the social web in which it is wound up, the way information is accessed by the scientist, is all then deeply infused with the social structures and values of that time. On the other hand, if the same scientist had chosen not to travel personally, but simply write letters to people in India, and this is, again, I'm going into this because you will see how this connects to the second part of my talk when I talk about my case study. So if the scientist had simply chosen to write letters and obtain his information by mail, again, many of the same questions would arise. Who would he write to? He would obviously write to somebody who can read the same language that he writes. He would write to somebody that he is likely to know through common social contacts. Again, those people would probably respond in very similar ways. They would ask other more subaltern figures and then come back with some information that was probably going to be transformed just through this communication channel. Either way, whichever two routes he takes, whether he comes personally or writes by mail, as I said, prevalent gender norms would mean that undoubtedly access would be mediated by gender. How many British botanists, whether they came to Bengal personally or wrote to someone for information, do you think would have actually been able to speak directly to women of the household, even elite women? It was highly unlikely that a British botanist would be able to speak to any elite woman about her knowledge of plants in the 1850s. Yet, as I'm sure many of you here will appreciate, and we all know, that a number of women, particularly older women in villages, do possess a lot of knowledge about plants, particularly useful plants, medicinal plants, the proverbial Ma Thakuma of common parlance. This wealth of information does not then get transmitted. So there is absolutely no way that that world of information connects up to the world of science. One particularly striking example like this that has been documented in other colonial contexts is how plants which play a role in fertility control, contraception, or sexuality gets, and knowledge of which is usually maintained by women and older women, is never transmitted to the botanical descriptions of those plants. Historians have documented how European scientists, when they encountered such plants in the colonies, failed to learn about their abortifacient or related properties because both the botanist and his go-betweens were all male. In the case, then there is another question that comes up. Even if you've collected the plants, you've got the information, how do you transport the plant? The plant, in the 1850s, travel infrastructures were such that it would take about 3 to 6 months to go by ship from Bengal to London. In the process, most plants will not survive. They will not survive because the climate on the sea is different. Who is going to water them? How are you going to maintain these plants? So in most cases, what happened was people did not actually get the original plant. what they got, and here maybe we could go to the next slide, please. What we got were illustrations like this. So these are illustrations from a very eminent botanist called William Roxburgh, who was head of the Shibpur Botanical Garden in the late 18th, early 19th century. And as you can already see, these are illustrations. The illustration of the lotus is highly stylized. The others are also very selective. But again, questions arise. Who painted these? Now, we know by the 19th century in Europe, botanical illustration was becoming a women's job. It was being highly gendered, and it was being socially framed as not being a part of the science itself. It was part of the humdrum, everyday aspect of science that science depended on, but was not considered scientific. So usually women of middle class and upper class backgrounds were taught to illustrate plants. These were used by male botanists, but they were never acknowledged, and the painting itself was not considered part of the scientific work. In India, even that limited access to female agency in botany was absent, because in India what happened was illustrations were usually done by men who had been trained in earlier Mughal schools of painting. And you can see some of this in this lotus image, which is, from its very stylization, you can see that it is gesturing back to older miniature styles of painting. So anyway, here again, then we have another way in which gender interfered and played a role in the way the object of botanical investigation was framed. So if you then imagine that students and successive generations of botanists who are being trained at elite British institutions like Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, are basically most often not seeing the actual plants, but seeing these kind of illustrations, then we have to factor in two things. First is that their access to the object is highly mediated, and that mediation is dependent on certain gendered forms of labor, which are being exploited for the production of scientific knowledge in highly hierarchized ways. And who is getting credit in this knowledge production is also highly gendered. The male scientist gets credit, but the female illustrator or the subaltern Indian miniature illustrator does not get any credit usually. And then even the names of these people have often been lost to us now. Botany, at least of the kind that I've been speaking of, the 19th century taxonomic botany, was a particular type of essentially field-based science. It required fieldwork. But let us not imagine that things have changed radically with the move into the laboratories. Even contemporary biological sciences like genetics continues to depend on samples, on working objects. It needs specific objects. The basic point I want to underscore is that all science, however universal its conclusions, will always be dependent on specific samples and specimens and generalize on the basis of that. And that is where history keeps coming in. So even today, when we are talking of genetic studies, we still have to ask, what was the sample? Where did it come from? Who handled it? Who gave information about it? Who had access to it? And questions like this. But sample acquisition is not the only way in which history intervenes and shapes the practice of science. Scientific conclusions also require interpretation. Consider, for instance, that famous and apocryphal example of the apple falling on Newton's head. Now, simply the act of an apple falling on Newton's head does not lead to the laws of gravity. It still requires interpretation. Newton or somebody else in his position at the time might have interpreted it in several ways. Newton interpreted it as gravity, that is the force situated within Earth that is pulling all things down. But somebody else could have interpreted it as a force emanating from the heavens that is pushing everything down. Somebody else might also have thought of some kind of invisible ether in which these things drown. So there could have been a lot of alternative and equally plausible explanations, even for a simple fact like an apple falling to the ground. There is always a need for interpretation. And what interpretation seems plausible is always a factor of the social context and the historical moment a scientist is based in. So interpretation in turn is where society and history can once more intervene in the practice of science. What kinds of interpretation seem plausible or even thinkable depends on the historical moment one lived in. In this foregoing discussion, this has been more abstract, and I have purposely not dwelt a whole lot on gender. I've made some brief comments about gender, but I've tried to keep it as general as possible because I do want to underscore the fact that we really need to recognize that scientific knowledge is always historically specific. That is the larger story. Gender forms a part of that story because our societies remain highly gendered and highly hierarchized. That component is part of this larger story. So anyway, I will now move into the second part of my talk, which is more specific and about a particular example. My example, and again, if we could go to the next slide, please. My example concerns one of the most famous names in 19th century science, Charles Darwin. Sorry, could we go to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So Charles Darwin. Today, of course, all of you, I'm sure, have heard of Darwin, and he's mostly remembered as the intellectual giant who discovered the theory of evolution and challenged the authority of the church to define human origins. Darwin's theory of evolution actually depended upon two separate processes that he had identified. The first of these, the so-called law of natural selection, was described by Darwin in his famous book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. This fact is widely known today. What is much less appreciated is that in The Origin of Species, Darwin says nothing about human beings. The first time he talks about human beings is in the very last sentence of the book. He does not actually touch upon it at all. And this was a conscious choice. The reason he did it is because religious leaders and the majority of the European public at that time believed that whatever might be the origins of other lower species, when it came to human beings, God had specially created them. And Darwin did not push back against this in 1859. What he did do was he waited till 1871 to write another book called The Descent of Man, by which time the theory of evolution had already attracted a lot of followers, to take up the human being for the first time. And when he writes about man, The Descent of Man, 1871, as you will see here, the subtitle to the book is Selection in Relation to Sex. So sexuality and gender are at the heart of the Darwinian explanation of human origins. Darwin, in Descent of Man, proposed a new theory of sexual selection as opposed to natural selection. Whereas natural selection entailed a process whereby an animal species changed by particular mutants, gaining an advantage by being better suited to its natural surroundings. That's what natural selection meant, that you occasionally get mutants, and the mutants that are best suited to its natural habitat will thrive more and pass on its inheritance more. Sexual selection was somewhat more agentive. In it, he proposed that the members of the group themselves choose particular types of mates. So they choose the females of any group, say birds will choose particular type of male birds more often than others. The males will choose females of a particular type. And in this way, it is a more conscious process. It is not the kind of blind process that natural selection is. Sexual selection, Darwin argued that the males of the species usually competed for the most favorable or desirable female. So here is a quote from the book where he says, with mammals, the male appears to win the female much more through the law of battle than through the display of his charms. What this law of battle means is that essentially he argues that the males of the species always fight for the right to mate with the best females. And what is considered best is again specific to these groups, these species. In the process, Darwin argued certain males had privileged access to certain females, and got the opportunity to produce more progeny. So their characteristics passed on. He used it to explain how human females apparently developed features like a softer voice, a fairer skin, lack of body hair, etc., whereas human males became larger, stronger, hairier, and so on. This, he further argued, eventually produced both the class system and also as values diverged the different human races. Both the theories of natural and sexual selection have been repeatedly refined over more than a century that has passed since. But they remain certainly part of mainstream science even today. Though today the mechanisms of inheritance posited by science are understood as being way more complicated than they had been in Darwin's time, there are several elements of the theory of sexual selection that continue to form part of mainstream science. To begin with, therefore, we should revisit this theory and to see what it was based on. Darwin's theory was premised on the basic idea that men and women are on two basic ideas rather. First, that men and women are two distinct, clearly defined groups with mutually exclusive characteristics. Today, faced with an increasing diversity of genders that no longer conforms to the simple man-woman binary, the distinction seems a lot less certain. It also raises the question of exactly how a man, quote unquote, is to be distinguished so clearly from a woman. Is it to be based on external physical criteria alone, which is what Darwin was doing? So men had certain manly characteristics and women had womanly characteristics. Or are we going to depend on genetic makeup? Both these criteria consistently produce a significant number of individuals who do not easily fit the binary. But this is so dimorphism itself becomes something that is taken for a fact in Darwin is a problem today. But even if we leave that aside, there is a second aspect to Darwin's theory, that this gender dimorphism had an evolutionary role, that it was both the product of and the driving force behind evolutionary change. Recalling our earlier discussions of how universal scientific laws eventually derive from the kind of specimen or sample that was used, we might ask, what was Darwin's evidence for this? What kind of samples did Darwin depend on? And here, reading the footnotes of Descent of Man is really illuminating. In the footnotes, we find that Darwin largely built his so-called law of battle on evidence drawn from the avian kingdom, from birds. He tried to find evidence of birds fighting, male birds fighting with each other over females, and how this leads to the development of more exaggerated fighting features like bigger claws, stronger beaks, etc. What is also interesting is that many of his examples came from the Indian subcontinent, and quite a few from Bengal. But of course we know that Darwin himself never actually came to India. So how did he get these examples? He depended on two people. One was T.C., if we could go to the next slide, please. So T.C. Jordan, the man on the left of your screen, who had written 3 volumes on birds of India, he depended on that. And he depended on this bearded man on the right of your screen, Edward Blyth, who was the museum curator of the Asiatic Society in Calcutta. Asiatic Society had a museum and he was the curator. Now, Jordan himself is interesting because Jordan was mostly based in the Madras presidency. He doesn't come to Bengal. He in turn relies on another doctor called James Taylor, who worked in Dhaka most of his life and wrote a short book. He depends on Taylor's writings to give examples. Whereas Blyth doesn't really write, but he's always there in Bengal, in Calcutta. Now, what becomes even more interesting is that in Taylor's original examples of birds fighting, nowhere does he say that the birds fighting were actually male birds fighting over a female. What he does talk about is that these were usually birds were made to fight by locals who specifically raised birds, and good fighting birds were highly valued, and this was a form of entertainment and betting. Blyth also talks about this, and in fact Blyth is an even more interesting character because Blyth was a bit of a problematic figure in that he was always short of money. And in fact, he had got the job in Calcutta due to Darwin himself giving him a reference saying he's a very good man and he needs money, so give him a job. In Calcutta also, he was constantly short of money and he made extra money by running a side business of being an animal trader. He sold animals, and particularly good dogs, pedigreed dogs, to the good and the great in Calcutta. So as you know, no doubt that many of the grand babus of Calcutta used to, like say the Marble Palace people and stuff, they used to have large menageries. They used to keep a lot of animals, and Blythe would often sell these animals. So Blythe had an inside access into this world of Babu culture. And one of the things that happened there was Pakhil Lorai, or the fighting of birds. This was a form of entertainment. These were usually organized in the winter months in open maidans. A lot of people assembled, and elite patrons owned birds, often bulbuls, who would fight. And people would bet on this. This was a form of popular entertainment. Now, Blythe, when he writes Blythe doesn't write a book. So basically the information he conveys to Darwin is through personal letters. When Darwin finds that Jerdon's information is incomplete and Jerdon doesn't know much about the bird fights, he writes to Blythe, and Blythe gives him information. But Blythe's information itself is possible only because he's running this side business of selling animals to the babus. More importantly, what also happens is that Blythe's information is also partial. Blythe also does not seem to mention that these animals are particularly raised. In fact, in that whole world of Babu culture, it is particularly valuable to make birds that don't usually fight. So one popular type of bird fight was the making of a bird called the Amadvat, or which in Bangla we call Lalmunias fight. And now Lalmunias are usually not birds that fight in nature, in the wild. They are taught to fight. They are just as particular forms of chicken or cocks are raised to fight. So that part of the human intervention, the shaping, the fact that these are not always male birds, all of that is lost. And based on this, Darwin comes up with his theory. So Darwin's actual working objects are so far mediated by the biases, but also at the same time, let us not forget the presence. Why was Jerdon and Blythe in India at this time? Why were they even able to see birds? Only because of the British Empire. I mean, if Darwin had been born 2 centuries earlier, he would not have known so many people in India to write letters to. So his information is already mediated by empire, but then it also gets mediated by this selective presentation of information. Moreover, we might also ask, why did Blythe not mention the fact that these birds were not always males, or that they were shaped by, they were particularly trained to fight? And why did Darwin so willingly give it a gendered interpretation? And this is where we have to look a little deeper into Darwin's own biography. So next slide, please. Yeah. So, here is another example, a painting of a bird fight. This was actually in Lucknow, but once the court of Lucknow, Wajid Ali Shah, once he gets exiled to Calcutta, he also brings this culture of bird fighting. And so bird fighting in a way in Calcutta also, sort of its popularity blossoms not only because of Wajid Ali Shah and his court, but also because so many of the rich people in Calcutta at that time are new elites, are parvenu elites who've made money over the last 1 or 2 generations and are looking for things which will consolidate their elite social status. So not only the Marble Palace dates, but the Rajas of Posta, who were also, or Chatu Babu, Latu Babu, who were all thought to be, who are all known to be major patrons of bird fighting. So there was also a sociological reason that was connected to the British Empire of why this kind of bird fighting was actually being encouraged and culturally becoming so popular. But next slide, please. Yes, so as I was saying, we need to look a little deeper in Darwin's own biography to understand why he gave it a gendered explanation. And one of the biggest things about Darwin is that Darwin's own intellectual hero was his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Erasmus Darwin had lived in the 18th century. He was a keen botanist and had written a number of books. Most famous among them is a very long book-length poem called The Botanic Garden, the second part of which is called The Loves of Plants. In it, he was the first person in Britain to try and adopt the Linnaean system of categorizing plants by their so-called sexual parts, the male parts and the female parts of every plant. This is no longer in vogue, but it was popular in the 19th century. In the 18th century, it was Erasmus Darwin, who first brought this to England. And he thought the way to popularize this would be to write a long poem in which the plants themselves are anthropomorphized. And as the title suggests, The Loves of Plants is a really long poem that depicts different plants almost in human form, having elaborate love lives and complicated adulterous relationships, etc., with other plants. And this was a way that Erasmus Darwin tried to popularize his theories. You can also see the frontispiece of his book, which is highly sexualized and depicts plants as this kind of sexualized woman. So Erasmus Darwin's ideas had a huge influence on Charles Darwin. He read his grandfather's works very closely, and in fact, Erasmus Darwin had also known Edward Blyth, the man in Calcutta that we've been speaking about. And so some of this sexualized interpretation was already forming in Darwin's mind way before he even got the evidence. He was already primed to have a sexual or gendered explanation for theories of reproduction and transformation of species. But there was another part to it. In Darwin's time, one of the big literary phenomena was Romanticism, British Romanticism. And British Romanticism was particularly keen on depicting British Romanticism in many ways was connected to its connection to India. People like Shelley, Byron write a lot of poems which are connected to India more specifically, or even more generally to Asia. And one of the things it does in the process is it takes on a particular motif called from Persian poetry called the Gul or Bulbul, which is the flower and the bulbul. And this is very common in Persian romantic poetry, where you have this motif of the bulbul being in love with the flower. And this is a love that can never be fulfilled because one is a plant, the other is a bird, but they're perpetually in love. And this leads to the unfulfilled love. And Persian poetry waxes eloquent on this. Now, this theme somehow became very popular amongst British romantics as well. And they picked it up. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So they pick up this idea. Next slide, please. Yeah. So here you see, on the one hand, Persian paintings of this Gul or Bulbul motif, where you see a bird sitting next to a flower. What happens when the British romantics take it up is that they make it into a much more violent image. Whereas in the Persian motif, it had been what we Bengalis would recognize as a kind of a Devdash trope, that unfulfilled love leads to a melancholic hero wasting away and eventually dying. So it's melancholia, it's sentimentality. Whereas in the British version of this particular motif becomes a much more murderous, violent motif, where unfulfilled love turns the male hero into a death-dealing avenger who hates the world and wants to bring down bloodbath on everybody. And this is particularly developed by Lord Byron. Now, interestingly, both this Byronic image is not only directly cited by Erasmus Darwin in his writings on plants as evidence of how plants and birds relate in the Eastern world in Asia, but Charles Darwin himself also, precisely at the time when he's beginning to think of the law of battle, writes in his diary that he has been reading Byron's poetry. So there are two sources through which this transformed Gul or Bulbul motif actually influences Darwin. On the one hand, through his grandfather, who also accepts it as some kind of a real representation of the Eastern state of affairs, but also Darwin's own reading of Byron. And he always loved romantic poetry, particularly Byron, and particularly the poem he loved and read multiple times, Giaour, is the one in which this motif, this violent motif of a male lover who has not been able to get his beloved becoming violent and enraged and fight and sort of fighting unnecessary wars is elaborated at length. So even though Darwin does not explicitly say so, there are enough biographical evidences to show that what made Darwin give this gendered explanation to the half-baked examples and instances he had picked up from Blyth and Jordan in Bengal was the influence of his grandfather as well as romantic poetry on him. Now, this is my case study, which shows kind of, as I was saying, how this kind of gendered social values permeate even the best scientists of this era. Now, I don't say this to somehow demean Darwin or to say that he was a bad scientist. Not at all. In fact, it proves how creative he was and how he was able to combine the different intellectual resources to come up with a new way of thinking. Because what we should always remember is that science also is a creative enterprise, just as literature or art is. And the best scientists are those who give us new ways of seeing the world. They might not be right or wrong, but they are novel ways of interacting with the world. And that's what Darwin was doing. So let me quickly move to the conclusion. In conclusion, what I just want to touch upon is that how can this knowledge of this sensitivity to the historically mediated nature of science, how can it help us in the present? I will just give you one example and conclude. Many of you, those of you who have taken biology classes at any point in school might remember that we were usually taught mammalian or human reproduction, the mechanisms of it, by saying that there was a static egg and there were lots of mobile male sperms that enter the reproductive tract of the woman. And these mobile sperms all try to fertilize the egg, and one of them succeeds in fertilizing the egg. However, in the 1960s, as we begin to get more female biologists, more women who are biologists, particularly women who are consciously connected to a feminist politics, some of them start developing an alternative model, and they show that this egg is not static. It is not just sitting there for one of these many sperms to compete and come and fertilize it, but the egg also has its own mobility, and fertilization happens when these two mobilities intersect. This is a very, very simple example of how something that is extremely technical and biological can actually be mediated by our gender stereotypes of a docile female who's just sitting there and the active, dynamic male who is then trying to reproduce. So this is, and the fact that the model changed because the actual scientists changed. There were more women scientists, and these people were explicitly feminists, and they did not like this model. So they consciously tried to think of other interpretations, get other kinds of data. So I think I will be citing that in conclusion to show how a historically sensitive understanding of what is science can also help us develop new and better models of science and scientific explanation, as well as push back against gendered hierarchies in society, which tend to legitimize themselves by saying that they're natural laws or that they reflect somehow how things are in nature, because our ideas of nature are always already formed by the mediation of social forces. So I will end there, and we probably have a few minutes for questions in case anyone has any. Thank you.
Thank you, Projit. We have been deeply impressed by your brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
You have rightly pointed out that how Charles Darwin, in the context of gendering science, has actually tried to show the male dominance. That point is really a new point. Now, it is open for discussion. I haven't got any question in the chat box. I request the participants to ask question or to give comments. If you have any questions.
May I put a query rather, Projit and Chairperson Madam?
Sure.
Actually, it's a query. Can this situation, as you have presented, definitely it has been presented in a very interesting way. We are illuminated. Projit, can it be somehow related to ethical values and the ethical aspects of reproduction or today's coinage, that is IVF reproduction, etc., etc. Looking forward your research work on this, and I hope that someday or other we will be able to listen it from you. And anyway, it's really very good presentation, Prissy. We are proud of you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, actually, I think ethical values are very directly connected to this, because there is a, like I was saying, in the case of the feminist scientists, it's their political commitment to a certain kind of social ethics that then leads them to try and look for new data and new interpretations. Similarly, I think where it always becomes imperative is once we recognize that all generalization is dependent on particular objects. That object, how we are acquiring it, how we are acquiring information around it, is always, that is where our ethics can come into play. We can, as scientists, we can say that we are not going to, we have, like for instance, today, if you look at a lot of biology research, it happens with particularly say research into cancer and things like that. That happens with experimental animals. So specially bred mouse, white mouse. Now these mice are highly specialized and they are actually being bred only to be cancer carrying organisms. Now there's a whole range of human ethics that comes into play. Should we even be doing this? Should we be producing animals that will be then tortured and get cancer? And so there are ethical questions there, but also there are questions of social ethics that today, since 1984, these animals are patentable. So there are companies that patent on the fly, which means that our access, if there is a poor scientist who does not have a huge research grant, simply cannot buy this mouse to conduct research. So, there's like, this is not a gender related example, but I'm just saying that once we recognize that all the complexity of society and ethics is tied up in that specificity, science and scientific publications always gives us the general conclusions and does not talk about their samples as much. But as historians or social scientists, if we go and look into their labs and see what is the specific sample, that is where we will find ethics, society, and all this complexity that is happening.
I have some questions now in the chat box. One question has been asked by Navonita. What is the name of the book written by James Taylor? Will you please answer?
I don't remember that off the top of my head, but if you email me, I can. I've got a PDF. I can send you the book also. So if you just email me, I can put my email in the in the chat box.
Yes, so please give the email. And Payal Roy, she has asked another question. Does Darwin say anything about sexuality or sexualities?
Yes, he has a lot to say about sexuality. In fact, his Descent of Man, which is a 2-volume book, is replete with comments on sexuality. And sexuality is actually the cornerstone, because as I said, he is saying that reproductive sexual choice is what what is driving human evolution, which is different from natural selection. So he calls it sexual selection. He has it, and he also tries to gather a lot of information, not only about human societies, but also about birds and animals. Most of it is about birds, like I was saying. But this information, all of that information, what I did with the birds, you can do exactly the same thing with what he's saying about sexual practices of different societies. He's getting the most racialized information from colonial interlocutors based in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and he's using that as evidence. So if you just read particularly the second volume of Descent of Man, there is a lot on sexuality.
Okay, thank you. Anjan Shaha has raised another question. That is, can you please share the names of books and journals on your presentation?
Well, I'm not sure much of what I was saying. That the Darwin story, I have written about it in a larger article. So that has appeared in a journal called British Journal of the History of Science. But again, if you email me, I can just send you the article.
And Shayante Doctor, she has also pointed out the same thing. Sir, can you please share the details of your references, books and journals? So more or less the same type of question.
Yes,
and request to you rather. Pooja Shukla has asked, can you please elaborate on botanical illustrator part or name some botanical illustrators?
Yes, absolutely. This is something, it's a fascinating topic. And like I was saying, that most of the Indian illustrations are done by people whose names have been forgotten. Recently, Henry Nolte, who was a curator of the archives of the Edinburgh Botanical Garden, he wrote a very nice book where he was able to identify two Indian illustrators called Gobindo and Rangaiah. We don't have any information about them, but he did it. But there are many others. This Roxburgh collection, which exists in Shibpur Botanical Garden as well, but they have been destroyed because one previous director decided that he could cut the illustrations and make them smaller. So a lot of information has been lost. But a duplicate set exists in the London Botanical Garden, Kew Gardens, and there I have seen some of them even have Bengali signatures at the bottom. But most of these artists were obviously coming from a social class and who did not sign their names. I mean, it's by the time you start getting like art college students and people doing illustrations, by that time photography is already displacing illustration. So illustration in botany thrives till up to say the 1870s, 1880s, but most of the illustrators are coming from a very low social class who have been usually trained, because earlier on they used to be trained in the courts of the Nawabs to illustrate manuscripts, because we didn't usually use print in India. Even though printing technology was known since the time of Akbar, we didn't use it. We used handwritten manuscripts, and those manuscripts, if you've seen old manuscripts, they have a big border which is very richly illustrated, and these people were trained for that. But when the Nawabs lose power and all the Jomidars also start losing power, these people need new employment, and they join various company establishments. Many of them are employed at the Shibpur Botanical Garden, and they do these illustrations. But there's very little work that's been done on the Bengali artists. Some of the names can be recovered if somebody goes through all the material in London. There are some names, like I remember seeing one Girindranath that was scrawled in Bengali on some of this thing. Yeah, but there's like Henry Nolte's is the only book that has been done, and that's mainly two artists based in Madras Presidency.
Thank you, Projit, for your very fascinating presentation, really fascinating. And many participants have also given you thanks. So we are now, is there any question? Any question?
I have one point to add, Projit. She's,
Yes.
I mean, Dr. Jayashree Mukherjee is ex-HOD of History Department, your college, Presidency College. She was in Rajat Babu's chair for a long time.
Oh my goodness.
I'm very glad to meet you, Projit.
Yeah, same here, same here. I've not been back to college for some time.
Actually, I came to presidency in 2001
Oh, I had left in 99.
when Rohan and Shobhan, Ajanta, they were.
Right. Okay.
So, is there any question or any comment? Then
I mean, I've put my email address, so if you have any
yes,
questions,
you
those
have
of you
given
who
your
want
email
references,
address.
just write to me. I can send you the references.